The real challenge about rare earths is not just digging them out of the ground. The difficulty is that almost all of our separation capacity, getting those rare earths out of the rest of the rock, currently sits in China. Now, what happened in 2025 was a wake-up call because we realized we couldn't even go 2 months before we had to stop American manufacturing. It was the most cataclysmic moment that we have had in modern economic history.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Asia Forward podcast, where we explore forward-thinking ideas in U.S. and Southeast Asia business. My name is Ei Thant Sin, and I will be your host today. We're going to dig deeper, not just onto the Earth's crust, but on the topic of critical minerals in Southeast Asia and why they matter to U.S. investors. We have here Dr. Gracelin Baskaran. She is the Director for Critical Mineral Security Program at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's a think tank in Washington, D.C., and she's going to help us bridge the gap between the high-level mining capability and the practical realities that U.S. businesses face in Southeast Asia. She can also help us explore on the topic of how critical minerals are reshaping geopolitics and national security as well. So thank you for joining our conversation today, Dr. Baskaran.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So before we talk about the broader category of critical minerals, there is rare earth elements which are under that category, which include 17 minerals and 17 metals. So as I was doing the research for this podcast, I realized that rare earths are not actually that rare. They can be found on every continent of the earth. So where did this misnomer come from?
So rare earths, finding them in a deposit that is commercially viable, dense enough, and high enough ore grade is the real challenge. Because the real challenge about rare earths is not just digging them out of the ground. You might have them in your backyard if you have one. Where it's difficult is finding them in that dense deposit, but then being able to separate it. Right. And so that is kind of our big challenge here in America is even though rare earths are in fact mined all over the world, right, from California to Australia to Asia, the difficulty is that almost all of our separation capacity, getting those rare earths out of the rest of the rock, currently sits in China.
So Southeast Asia is quickly becoming a vital global hub for critical minerals. And what counts as rare earths? In Southeast Asia, where are those deposits could be found?
So rare earths are 17 minerals, as you said, and I like to call them the words that are the hardest to win in the spelling bee. It's like praseodymium and terbium and dysprosium, right? And these rare earths, for context, are actually used in every part of our national and economic security. On the national security side, we think about them in defense technologies like fighter jets, warships, lasers, missile, tanks, everything you need for the warfighter. But the other part of that we forget is that they're actually vital for our economy. So I'm from Detroit. I love the auto industry. And actually rare earths are in everything from your motor to your seatbelt to your door to your steering wheel. So when China restricted rare earths, it meant that like even our auto manufacturers from Japan, Suzuki to Ford in Chicago actually had to pause manufacturing. Now, if we step back and we look at what is Southeast Asia's role in this, it's really threefold. The first is it does have really good deposits. Malaysia has phenomenal deposits of ionic clay rare earths, for example, right? That when I think about getting more material, countries like Malaysia, India, really, really crucial. India has one of the biggest deposits in the world. The second part of it is where is the processing happening, right? And Malaysia actually last year became the first country outside of China to separate heavy rare earths at scale. And this came via an investment from an Australian company called Lynas. But the third part of it, and maybe it's not Southeast, but it's Asia and very much part of the ecosystem, is who is investing in the R&D to learn how to do these things, right? And that's where Japan is really important. And Japan is important because when Malaysia, the rare earths are coming from Australia, they're getting separated at this new facility in Malaysia, and the offtake is going to Japan. And it really highlights how vertically integrated the Asian ecosystem is for rare earths, that every one of these countries in that region have a role.
So you said Malaysia has Lynas refinery plant. That's the only non-Chinese refinery that we have. What is stopping the other ASEAN countries from having that model?
So one of the reasons that the only place we did this for a long time was China is because it's technologically complicated, right? And when I say that, rare earth separation can have upwards of 50 steps. So it's not like you put the material and out comes the rare earths. Like, it's a very technically complicated process. And one of the things that China did in December 2023 was they banned the export of rare earth processing technology because they didn't want to let anyone else learn how to do it. So one is that it's challenging. The second thing is that it's very expensive. Here in the United States, we have put over $1 billion now through things like our Defense Production Act to subsidize building another heavy rare earths and a light rare earths facility in Texas and California. So it's extremely expensive. It's very complicated. And the third thing is you have to get enough actual material out of the ground to make it make sense, right? And so we don't have a lot of major rare earths mining outside of a couple of countries. And so you have to make the economics work. So you're not going to build, unlike nickel, right, in Indonesia, where we built so many processing facilities, arguably too many, you always have to make sure that the calculus works out.
It's like have a good payoff.
You have to have a good balance.
Right.
You don't want to run a bunch of economically unviable processing facilities, given how expensive they are.
So would the countries prefer this like vertical mining process where like mine to manufacture in one country, or would it be better to mine somewhere, send it somewhere to process, and then, like you said, to Japan and Australia? What is the model that they're going right now, and is it sustainable?
I think the model that people are looking at are more of the second. And the reason is this: we don't mine rare earths in every country, right? And so what you almost want to do is you want to create like a hub, right? And what we're doing now is Malaysia is emerging as a key hub because the rare earths being processed there aren't necessarily just Malaysian, right? They're Australian. And as more countries mine in the region, it can become a hub. Other hubs we see emerging globally: Saudi Arabia, the United States, Japan, Australia. So we're creating these hubs so that wherever the minerals come from, they can go to maybe the closest hub. And for a long time, that's exactly the playbook China had, except it was the only hub.
So you said like China restricting export of critical minerals to United States. It's like a part of the trade confrontation that they have. So how did the decision impact the United States?
So when China made that decision, it was the most cataclysmic moment that we have had in modern economic history. Because here's the thing, right? The United States, let me give you a little bit of history for the US, is we were the top rare earths producer in the world until the 1980s, right? We built that through the Ames laboratory. But the 1990s marked a sharp change in our minerals policy. And that was because the Cold War ended. So we have a tendency when we have conflict or potential conflict, we tend to ramp up our minerals policy, right? We started stockpiling in 1939. Roosevelt wrote a letter and he said, I worry we may not have the materials we need and we could go to war. Jimmy Carter in the 70s said, I'm concerned we're overly reliant on the Soviet Union. But when the Cold War ended, we got comfortable. So we sold off 97% of our defense stockpile. We closed our Bureau of Mines, and we kind of let that slide. Now, what happened in 2025 was a wake-up call because we realized we couldn't even go 2 months before we had to stop American manufacturing. That obviously puts factory jobs at risk. That affects household. That affects every part of us. So that was where the whole world shifted, because what China did is they didn't only restrict rare earths to the US, they restricted rare earths to the entire world. And in doing that, it meant that every country outside of China started working together to create these ex-China supply chains. And within the first 8 months of that decision, you saw rare earths specifically featured in our bilateral cooperation agreements with Thailand, Cambodia, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Australia, go on, is because they became the focal point of global cooperation to ensure that manufacturing in Japan doesn't stop, that manufacturing in Australia doesn't stop. So it really kicked off a global effort, which the US led the way on.
Well, you kind of answered that a bit, but like building on that, like how is United States countering China's supply chain dominance, right? And I want to highlight on how does the critical minerals in Southeast Asia play a role in this crossfire?
So there's two ways to think about what the U.S. is doing, and it's actually exactly what China did. It's not that different. So the first thing is we are doubling down here at home on our domestic industrial strategy. I told you we have spent billions of dollars, right, in rare earths, loans, equity, and other forms of support to get rare earth mining, processing, and permanent magnet manufacturing online at home. But rare earths have very much been our currency of global engagement, right? And if you think about Asia, Malaysia now has an agreement, Japan has an agreement, Cambodia, Thailand, South Korea. I mean, all of these countries are arguably, you have seen more progress on the U.S.-Asia commercial diplomacy relationship in the last year through rare earths than you have seen in decades.
But those countries somehow already have deals with China in terms of friendshoring. Even if they're willing, how likely are these countries in Southeast Asia be able to partner and be away from China's hand?
So think about it this way. For a lot of countries that are what we might call middle power or emerging economies, they want more than one source of investment and they want more than one source of offtake. And this is particularly important in the last few years since the COVID pandemic because the Chinese economy is not what it was. And what I mean by that is China's deflation is the highest in modern economic history. They have high youth unemployment. They have their property sector has gone bankrupt. They have soft consumer demand. Relying on China as your only investment partner now is a red flag for your own economy. So what we're seeing is that countries, whether in Asia, Africa, Latin America, are looking for diverse partners. And this is where countries like the U.S. and Japan have an important role to fill. What we are looking at is to get new projects online, new facilities online, and to sign that offtake, right, back to the United States so that we can supply our defense technologies and our commercial technologies. So really what we're seeing is we're not telling countries, oh, you can only work with America, right? We're not putting that ultimatum on them because that ultimatum will never work in our favor. They have way too much Chinese investment. What we do want to do is create some supply chains with these countries that don't have China in them, but it's a de-risking mechanism for both us and the host jurisdiction.
Thank you, Dr. Gracelin Baskaran. And to our viewers, if you're enjoying our conversation, please click subscribe on our channel. So recent reporting from Reuters reveal United States has newfound interest in my home country, Myanmar, and for its rich deposit of heavy rare earth elements. But against the backdrop of civil war and the areas where those critical minerals mines in Myanmar are being controlled by Kachin armed groups. So with China having this almost absolute control over the mining and processing, is it even plausible for the United States to become a player in that field?
It's complicated. Myanmar's complicated now. But I'll tell you this, we had those rare earth export restrictions in April last year. People don't realize that over half of China's heavy rare earths come from Myanmar. But what happened in February is the Kachin armed groups kind of made progress and got some of them around to some of the mines. There was an 89% drop year on year in heavy rare earth exports from Myanmar to China. So China's posture in April to restrict exports was also a defensive posture, right? Because they had significant less material coming in owing to the armed conflict in Myanmar. So it highlights that even China is not immune to the political complexities of supplier countries. Look, going forward, Myanmar is a very crucial country in terms of rare earths, but it's not an easy country. And it's not really up to the United States to whether stability ensues there. In fact, resources often are a driver of conflict, right? Because in a single asset that I can go expropriate could be billions of dollars of value. And so that can make it an easy target, and it can make it difficult for companies to feel confident in a jurisdiction. There are not many mining companies that are going to feel confident in sinking a multi-billion-dollar investment into Myanmar today. So it's one of those countries that has a lot of long-term potential, but there's a lot of challenges in terms of investor confidence.
So the heavy rare earths that can be found in Myanmar are dysprosium and terbium. So those kind of minerals, what are they going to be used for? And will they be useful for the United States to get a hold on?
So those heavy rare earths, China never restricted our light rare earths, which is really interesting. So those rare earth export restrictions last April did not apply to all 17. It applied to 7 heavy rare earths. And the reason they did that is because we actually mined light rare earths. We have a lot of light rare earths in America. We can separate light rare earths in America. So our choke point was not the lights, it was the heavies. So that is what they weaponized. Look, at the end of the day, those heavy rare earths are really crucial for permanent magnets. China currently manufactures 93% of the world's permanent magnets. Those are magnets so powerful that if you put them next to your fridge would fall over. Like, they are very, very powerful. And they are used particularly in defense technologies, but they are used in other forms of consumer technology. So where you have seen the U.S. really double down on finding mines, building capabilities, are those heavy rare earths. And that is why Asia remains a very important partner to the United States.
I want to go back to the broader category of critical minerals. And with Indonesia having, especially in nickel, it has become a major player. And nickel is used in EV batteries and clean energy supply chain. So how does the role of Indonesia is shaping critical mineral landscape right now?
Yeah, Indonesia is a huge beneficiary of the mining sector, and they obviously have a global command on nickel. The difficulty is this. In the last 6 years, between 2020 and 2026, Indonesia has surged their nickel production by 400%. Now, supply has not grown 400%. And what that essentially means is that supply is much higher than demand, so nickel prices have collapsed. And they've collapsed so hard that Australian companies operating in Australia, a Swiss company operating in New Caledonia, have actually had to close down their nickel mines. The difficulty for the U.S. is a lot of the investment in Indonesia is still Chinese, right? So it remains a vulnerable supply chain to us. But the important thing that we also have to be cautious with Indonesia is Indonesia applied very rigorous export restrictions to not just nickel, but copper and to bauxite. And in some ways, other countries want to be like Indonesia, where when they applied these restrictions, they got value addition and beneficiation domestically. But we have to remember it worked for nickel, but it did not work for bauxite. There was a huge drop off in bauxite mining that as soon as those restrictions went into effect, and Guinea in West Africa became the big beneficiary. So copper mixed reaction, right? Freeport stayed, Newmont left. So we do have to acknowledge that while Indonesian nickel is important, we have to be more careful about the way we apply restrictions, because if you apply too many of them, you can deter investors.
Could you tell us more about the recent deal between the U.S. and Indonesia and the implications that apply for that?
Yeah, the February trade deal between the U.S. and Indonesia had a very strong critical minerals component. I mean, some of the things, for example, were exempting certain exports from the restrictions to coming to the U.S., addressing non-tariff barriers, addressing the labor situation. It's a really big step in terms of export barriers. The difficulty is Indonesia has had a highly volatile set of export policies. And one of the challenges for any investor going into Indonesia is whether they feel confident in the stability of policies. Generally, you want to guarantee policies in mining for a period of 10 years, right? Minimum for an investor to feel confident. And it's not clear at this point how much longevity it has.
So we talk about nickel in Indonesia, but how about other critical minerals in Southeast Asia? Where does it all fit in?
So when we think about critical minerals, there's a lot of them, right? There's 60 of them. And there are certain hubs of that, right? Even in Indonesia, there are other minerals like cobalt, for example, right? We now know that the DRC can be not only the main supplier, but you could add Indonesia into that mix. You obviously have good copper deposits. One of the biggest copper smelters in the world is sitting in Indonesia. You have rare earths. Vietnam has a lot of rare earths. India has a lot of rare earths. Myanmar has a lot of rare earths. When I think about, there's copper sitting in that region. The difficulty, though, is we don't have a lot of geological data on a lot of parts of Asia. And what that makes it challenging is there's a lot of unknown potential, So this is why you saw things like geological mapping feature in the bilateral agreement between the U.S. and countries like Thailand and Cambodia, where there's a lot of unknown potential. So what the first thing that we need to do, not we as the U.S., but like we as greater society, is to build our data and do a full mapping of the region. Because once we have a better understanding of what minerals are there, what are the ore grades, what other minerals are they found with, because minerals are rarely found alone, we can then start to get exploration investment and then production investment. So the road to developing Asia's resources remains long, but very promising.
So when you say working together with the United States, that's like exploration, geomapping about where the mines are. Is that how Southeast Asian countries are going to work together with the U.S. in the near future?
They're going to work with the U.S., but I suspect it won't just be the U.S. I think that there's a consortium of countries looking to make these investments, right? And when I think Japan, really big one, right? They already signed the offtake agreement in Malaysia. Australia is playing really big. They themselves are a big mining country, but they're also looking at strategic investments globally. Canada, making big investments. European Union is starting to look at their investment strategy in minerals more carefully. So really, I don't think it's about the U.S. being the only partner, because quite frankly, we don't have all the money that we need. We don't have all the geologists that we need. We don't have the data systems that everybody needs, but it will be working with a group of allies.
So when we have the China restricting exports on minerals like gallium and germanium, a lot of U.S. companies that are relying on those minerals would be in a difficult position. So how could U.S. investor predict what kind of minerals would be on the restriction list, and how can they realistically protect themselves?
The U.S. is never going to publish a list of where they're most vulnerable, because that would be handing information to the bad guys, but what you can do is it's very easy to see where we are most reliant on an adversary, right? So when I say adversary, it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. So primarily that's going to be China and Russia. Is where we are 95% reliant on China is a bigger concern to the United States compared to where we are 35% reliant, right? So you can start to see that what China has strategically done for 3 years now, right? You mentioned germanium and gallium.
Yeah.
Then it got expanded to antimony, tungsten, graphite, and then rare earths. So we know that they're going to weaponize minerals. So the ones where we have a highest supply chain reliance are going to be the ones that they're going to hit first.
You recently testified before the Senate about building a critical mineral workforce. So hypothetically, if a U.S. tech company is going to build a manufacturing base in Southeast Asia, what specific skills are currently missing in the local labor market that will be essential for the rare earth economy?
So that skill shortage is everywhere. I mean, I'll give you a fun fact. Here in the U.S. in the next 3 years, 50% of our mining workforce is going to retire. That's over 220,000 workers. And I can tell you one thing, we are not building 220,000 people to replace that. Mining is a difficult field for 2 reasons. One, it's not a sexy field to go into. No kindergartner says, Mom, I want to be a miner when I grow up. They don't want to be miners and they don't want to be farmers, but you need minerals and you need food. The second part of why it's hard is mining is not a low skill industry anymore. 40 years when if you and I went to a mine, you'd have a guy who'd go put a blast and then he would run away and then the rock would blow up and we'd hope everybody got away from the blast fast enough. It's all AI and engineering now, right? Often an entire mine is run a few miles away through what looks like a mission control room. The skills you need for that are primarily engineering. It's STEM fields. And the difficulty is I can't take an 18-year-old and turn him into a mine engineer. I actually have to start with good math and science education early on to get to a point where he can go into engineering. And so a lot of the challenges we currently have, both in the U.S. and certainly in emerging economies, is can we get that engineering, the geoscience, the engineering workforce developed, right? And it pays very, very well. If I had a kid, I would certainly send them to college to go be a mine engineer now. But yeah, it's a hard workforce to build.
I've heard people describe this shift for this green mining or critical mining as like the next gold rush. And I've heard the saying from Mark Twain, I think. It says during the gold rush, it's a good time to be in the pick and shovel business. So using that as a metaphor, What are the pick and shovel business right now in tandem to the critical mining industry?
So a lot of the industries that are going to succeed when mining does well is everything that use minerals. The big one I would point to now is data centers, right? Data centers are incredibly mineral intensive. And particularly one of the reasons you see so much money going into copper mining is because every gigawatt of applied power requires 16,000 tons of copper. And so when you think about global data centers, it's very minerals intensive, right? So I would think about the strategic, I would think about semiconductor manufacturing because the world is racing to build semiconductors outside of, the Indo-Pacific region. I would think about data centers. I would think about cars, right? Designing the cars of the future. So all of these are materials intensive industries. Energy is a big one. One of the reasons the U.S. is not structurally competitive as a processing or mining jurisdiction is because energy is so expensive. The amount of energy we need to build, both generation, but also transmission lines, again, very mineral intensive, is significant. So all of these industries are going to grow in the future, and it's what economic growth is tied to.
As we are Asia Forward, I want to end on the note on forward-looking question. So where do you see the role of Southeast Asia in the global supply chain of critical minerals in the next 5 to 10 years realistically?
Asia is one of the biggest sources. Asia outside of China is one of the biggest sources of untapped mineral potential, and it has systematically attracted the lowest levels of exploration investment in the world for the last decade. Meaning that the first thing we need to do is to get more early stage exploration investment in there. But what you really see is a region, a very connected ecosystem where you could mine, process, and build manufacturing. Right. And with the proximity of hubs like South Korea and Japan nearby that become an important supplier to the U.S., but also become its own economy and supply its own manufacturing.
How much of the U.S. economic growth would be dependent on Southeast Asia in the 5 to 10 years future?
The mineral potential of Southeast Asia will be really central to economic growth, but also stability, to diversifying the global supply of minerals and ensuring that countries, whether U.S., Australia, Japan, European Union, have a resilient supply.
Like diversifying away from China.
Absolutely. It is really hard to see a future of rare earth security without Vietnam and without Myanmar and without Malaysia. But it goes two ways, right? If Myanmar doesn't have greater stability, it is going to be impossible for me to get an investor in there with billions of dollars feeling confident that that is a protected asset. So it really goes that there's reforms on both sides that can strengthen Asia's position going forward.
Well, thank you so much for your great insight. And then I think we learned so much about the geopolitics that critical minerals industry is shaping right now. So thanks for joining our conversation. And thank you, Dr. Gracelin Baskaran.
Thanks for having me.
And to our audience, thanks for tuning in. You can find our full episodes on YouTube and Spotify. And you can also find us on our social media at LinkedIn, Instagram as well. Please visit our website at asiaforward.org. Stay tuned for a full episode. My name is Ei Thant Sin, and I'll see you next time.